Hi, welcome to the session on policy process, and we shall focus on the policy cycle, its usefulness, and criticisms. So, when we were looking at in the previous session, when we were looking at the theories and models of policy, one of the several policy and theory models we talked about was the policy cycle or the policy process, which looks at the whole idea from the initial identification of the policy problem up to the evaluation phase. So we'll look at this in details, and like I said, so our arguments here are more focusing on DIE's definition of what the government decides to do or not. So and you can have the readings even more provided in the learning Moodle page. So in this session we shall try to appreciate and recognize the policy cycle, or in other words the policy process, the usefulness of the policy process model, and of course some of the problems or the criticisms towards the policy cycle model. So let's begin. So just a mere question that you could reflect on. Have you ever asked yourself or wondered about something or an issue and then tell yourself or someone, I think the government needs to do something about this? So that something is the problem or an issue. In other words, a policy problem or a policy issue, and therefore it is a public problem. If it affects the public, of course, so therefore it becomes a public policy problem. So just think about all the problems that you may think about now. For instance, if you're doing the program on human rights, think about the problems or issues that are human rights related or humanitarian concerns. Of course, we are going to look at these in the next session. So public policy process, or a decision made by government to either act or not to act in order to resolve a problem, and therefore a problem requires a well thought model to be addressed, and therefore that brings us the policy process in which we can then apply the policy cycle model, which will be our main focus for this course. So Neil and 2028 states that they state that policy making is characterized by the presence of multiple constraints, e.g., shortage of time and resources, public opinion, the constitution, etc., and existence of various policy processes, different departments such as the street bureaucrats and other administrative overlaps, competing with each other, for instance, different ministries, and of course an infinite cycle of decisions and policies. So the process of a policy cycle, in other words, whereby the last stage leads straight back to the first, indicating that the policy cycle is continuous and unending, because at the end of the day, as we shall see, the decisions can be taken to either terminate the policy or create a policy change, but also as new policies, I mean policy problems are still coming in. So that's why this continuity and unending process continues, which then he terms as a cycle. So the policy cycle, what it is. So it's a sequenced, according to Harriet and Ramesh, it's a sequence. It's a sequenced policy process. Initial, of course, proposed by Harold Roswell in 1950s. We already looked at the definition by Harold Roswell in our first session during the definitions of public policy. So the policy cycle has to do is a systematic process, which means it is structured, showing how problems are identified and then acknowledged and then they are solved. So it's done in a step by step. Although we might at some time also appreciate or recognize that while it is a step by step, we cannot entirely conclude that it is linear in a sense, because it involves all back and forth kinds of processes, which means it is characterized by iterative plays that involve back and forth decision makings or consultations, so that better things are done. So it shows the procedure how a problem or how solutions are construed or constructed in from a policy perspective. So it's intentionally iterative. Of course, that's what I just said. By Freeman also says that because policy activities are recurrent and instruments used are used repetitively to effectively solve the identified problem. So sometimes, yeah, according to Stone and Maxwell, of course, sometimes this is looked at as an excessive linear view of policy, but of course it isn't in a sense linear, although it depicts a step by step in a formality that one step leads to the other. So it has those disaggregated series of discrete sequential stages where you have one step depending on the other to happen. For instance, for a decision to be made, then the issue has to go through agenda setting so that they can discuss about it and then analyze it, and then a decision can be made, as we shall see. But however, the logical is applied in the problem solving. Rational, balanced, objective, and analytical processes are also realized in that case. But of course, also Dye also says that it's a series of political activities, because this involves an interaction between actors and several decision-making processes. So for some, you'll see that it is divided in different stages, and it can also be divided in many other steps depending on who defines it or who draws the steps. You can also create your own, as long as it depicts a formality in the process within it. So the common stages could be looked at from Harriet and Ramesh's 2003 layout, which has to do with agenda setting, policy formation, then policy decision making, policy implementation, and then policy evaluation. But others other policy cycles or other scholars have dissected these other main steps, 5 steps, into around 10. So it depends on who, how you want to design it, or how you want to dissect it. So others have problem recognition, then agenda setting, you have problem exploration, identification of possible solution, analysis, selection of policy options, implementation, monitoring and reporting, evaluation, and then discontinuation or continuation, if you may, especially if you, it's just an evaluation is just done for further implementation. So this is the basic cycle structure. So you have problem identification here, which leads to agenda setting, which leads to policy development, or policy formulation, if you will, then policy implementation, and then evaluation, and then the cycle goes back. But here I give a yes, it's the same cycle, but then I go on and try to bring in the idea that of a more dissected, but bringing in the whole idea of how problem is identified. So you'll see that here you have public issues or societal problems, and if they are identified, they move to agenda setting, they can be analyzed and designed, and then legitimized through decision making. Implementation takes place, and policy evaluation happens, which may lead to either policy change, and then the policy change goes back to agenda setting, or new problems are identified, or policy evaluation could lead to policy termination, which can initiate further decision making on whether they should terminate it or not, or how they should terminate it. So you can also have another perspective of it. Okay. So you also have other possible ways here by Maza, Bessie, and Blink. Blink, they give problem recognition, and through all these other phases as a cycle. So in other words, different scholars have different ways of dissecting the policy cycle, but the whole formality, or the ideal is the same. That at least a problem is recognized, and it goes through phases of decision making activities until evaluation is done, and then the cycle continues again. So let's now take a look at the explanation of the policy process. So in here, we are saying that societal problems are recognized, and therefore that is problem identification, and the government is needed for intervention, and therefore issues make it to the agenda setting, and then they are discussed, and then the government institutions formulate alternative policies. They select policy solutions, and these solutions get to be implemented and evaluated and then revised, and then the cycle repeats itself, or the policy is terminated. So this is the simple depiction of a policy process. But let's take a look at each of these phases. So let's begin with one, the problem identification. So problem identification of public policy may involve specific identification of those issues that are deemed to affect the public. So in this case, we are talking about those that that can affect the public in general, those that have impact on the public. We're not talking about organizational policies here. Okay, so socioeconomic, and we have many problems, socio-economic and political problems, of course, that those that, from a human rights perspective, those that have an impact on human rights or humanitarian agenda. And of course, this happens when individuals or groups, could be mass media or interest groups or citizen initiatives or public opinion, make demand upon the government that something should be done. And therefore, in that case, the problem can be recognized as a problem, a public problem or public issue or public concern, that can be taken up for assessment to see if a solution can be provided. So the need for a new policy or new policy provisions within existing policy is identified or confirmed, and then prioritization is made through publications, but mostly depending on the public demands. And of course, we shall later look at the public as part of the policy cycle in the coming sessions, where we shall be looking at the official and unofficial public policy actors. So when the problem has been identified, it goes to what we call agenda setting. So the next step for policy process is the agenda setting. So identified problems attract public attention and compel public officials to respond in the agenda setting discussion. So agenda setting, in other words, is the process by which problems come to the attention of the government. And then, of course, there are many public problems, many public problems. So that itself makes a list. For instance, if you could remember how, when we were looking at the garbage can model, how we describe the garbage can model, that many problems keep coming in, and then there is a list, so the government keeps getting a few from it. So you can imagine how many problems are out there that require government solution. Of course, while in most uh, governments, in most societies or countries, governments prove to be the problem. In other countries, the government has the solution to particular problem. Of course, we cannot deny that should be the ideal, of course. Okay, so a list of public problems that are chosen and recognized by decision makers makes it to the agenda setting. And of course, we have two different aspects of agenda setting according to Stone. So you have the public agenda, which depend on the public opinions, but of course, in most cases, it is difficult because the public is always at conflict in terms of who needs what, and why should we take yours as the main priority or not. And of course, considering that the public has many different perceptions or views on a particular problem. Then there is also the formal agenda, which depends on the decision makers, officials, and politicians in any selected section or level of government. So therefore, we have bottom up, which is public opinion, and then top down, by elites, for instance. So the one aspect is that the public initiates, or the policy cycle begins from the public opinion, but on the other hand, it is top down, where the elites or the government, through the institution or the institutions, decide that certain problems must be addressed in this way or the other, without even depending on what the public considers. Okay, so Definitely not automatic, but socially constructed process. It's not that it has to be there, but definitely discussions and considerations must be made depending on a particular problem that has been identified. And of course, agenda setting is also it's as a process. It is influenced by interests and ideologies of different actors and institutions, because they are the ones that have the upper hand in deciding which issue should make it to the agenda, and if it makes it there, which one should be prioritized. Of course, depending on different actors, factors, including resources or the environment under which that particular problem should be considered as a bigger priority. So many problems, there are many problems, of course. Like I said, it's a whole, it's a big list, but there is scarce space on agenda setting, very scarce space for all those problems. So some make it while others do not. And of course, when we get to the session on agenda setting, we look at some of the factors why some problems are never considered on agenda setting, why others make it while others do not, or why others are neglected while others are prioritized. Excuse me. So, um, eh, non-decision making and decision making to prioritize requires immediate action. Remember the definition we were looking at, what the government decides to do or not to do. So even on agenda setting, the government decides to dump some problems, while on the other hand, it could prioritize and accept others. So it makes the scarce space on agenda setting makes it difficult for others to other problems to be considered, and therefore it does not automatically mean that if the problem makes it on the agenda, the government will automatically decide to take it upon itself to solve it. No, not really. So when the problem has made it to the agenda and assessments have been done and analysis has been done, uh, alternative options have been looked at. Uh, that takes us to the third step, which is policy formulation, which involves developing the policy. So proposals to resolve issues and ameliorate problems are considered and presented on tables or for discussion and analysis. So possible policy actions are defined, discussed and accepted or rejected depending on the impact they would have, or depending on the resources that are available for implementation of the solutions. And of course, that is somehow constrained, and we have two major constraints that are involved here. So we have substantial constraints, which have to do with the nature of the problem, but we also have procedural constraints which have to do with the procedures involved in adopting a policy adoption, or in adopting a policy alternative. So those are some of the constraints when it comes to analysis. So before policy, for other policy processes, before policy formulation, you will see they have a particular segment for policy analysis, which can be looked at differently or in isolation from policy formulation. But for this, we are adopting just policy formulation as an immediate step after agenda setting. So, in other words, so the nature of the problem can limit a certain policy solutions to be adopted, or policy alternatives, or the procedure that would involve in the implementation process also may constrain the agenda setting process, but also including the interests and alignment of the different actors involved in the agenda, in the formulation of the process, including politicians and administrators within the public institutions. So, policy formulation occurs in government bureaucracies, interest groups, offices, legislative committees, meetings of special commissions. All these can be involved in the policy formulation process, including even think tanks. We are going to look at all these actors in the session on policy actors. So recommendations are then disseminated among responsible agencies and public through media, laying the groundwork for policy making in thorough. So you have alternatives that have been assessed, and then they are made available for public if the public opinion is required, or or if the experts are required to also be part of the analysis and formulation process, and then as they lay ground for acceptable alternatives that are legitimate to most of the stakeholders. And of course, core functions of policy formulation, we have planning, analysis, which has to do with documentation of the problem, policy design, which has to do with development of political solutions, where those proposals have been made and approved, and then you have consultation to see if the proposed policy alternative are acceptable by different stakeholders. So therefore the importance of relationship between government and social actors is very important when it comes to policy formulation, because at the end of the day, if these consultations or alternative designs are made, then it could be that in some context the policies might not work because such consultations were not made to see the feasibility of such a policy alternative that is being thought about. So number 4, that brings us to policy adoption or legitimization, or in other words, decision making. So legitimization of possible alternative solutions that have been formulated depend on the acceptance of the different actors. So such acceptance and approval by different actors would definitely impact on whether the policy is decisions are made to accept it or are made to not to legalize it or make it into law. So choosing, of course, it involves choosing from among. So you have many different alternatives that have been done during through the proposals at the formation stage, and then the decision makers must make a choice of an alternative that is more that would create more impact, while again costing less in that case, if you may say. So this is a process by which governments adopt a particular course of action. So for instance, you see, that's why you see, okay, the particular committees go and draft proposals and propose alternatives, and then after it brings those particular alternative solutions to the table in parliament, and the parliament tables it and debates upon it, and then to see which solutions can be taken as solution to particular problems. So the parliament could say yes, okay, or they could say, okay, take it back and look for other alternatives, and then it's upon the committee members to go back to the formulation table. And this is why I was saying earlier that it is an iterative process, rather than just construing it entirely as a linear process, because there is this back and forth kind of political activities. So the core functions of legitimization, you will see that they have to do with uh, selecting a proposal, then developing political support for it, then you have enacting it into law, and then deciding on its constitutionality. Legitimize. That's why we bring in the idea of legitimization. Um, so fact is that decisions made may be positive, so aimed at creating change by solving the problem, or could be negative, therefore leaving the problem at hand the way it is, depending on uh, other priorities that are in place. And of course, final adoption is done by the government institutions that are affected by many factors influencing the policy actors. And some of these constraints are related to public adoption, instruments, or resources, uh, depending on what is available or not available. So the next is policy implementation, which involves executional plans that have been made earlier during formulation and decision making. So therefore, policy implementation has to do with putting in action what has been planned. Okay, so theory into practice, in other words. So this is the transition of plans into practice. So putting solution into effect. And of course, it involves huge allocation of resources and assignment of responsibilities for purposes of efficiency and effectiveness. Um, Efficiency has to do with how resources or time is used according to plans, and with, in other words, performance towards achieving the intended objectives of the policy, while effectiveness has to do with the questions of whether the policy is achieving the intended goals or not. So it requires operational rules and regulations, because if there are no rules and regulations, then the responsible actors or implementers of the policy might behave deviantly from how things are supposed to be done. So any policy is operated or implemented according to laws and regulations of particular agencies and bureaucracies for purposes of regular monitoring of the activities and resources. Otherwise, that's why you because of lack of a better monitoring and evaluation system of policy implementation. That's why you always hear that actually Uganda is one of those countries that always has the best policies, but when it comes to implementation, it is very it is doing badly. So civil servants' personal tendencies, for instance, ideologies, interests, or thinking influence the implementation, and therefore could be on one side it could be constraints, on the other could be uh, could act uh, as support to towards could act as scaffolds towards the implementation of that particular policy. So implementation is purely technical in nature because it involves those who know how things should be done, and therefore sometimes open to some changes, especially if monitoring is done and they find that some things are not actually running the way they are supposed to run. Because remember, there is ideal versus reality. So during formulation and adoption of the policy alternatives, predictions are being made and forecasts are being made, but that is the ideal. But when reality chips in during implementation, then particular changes must be made. and of course that's why monitoring is important, so that the bureaucrats or the implementers can see whether things are running according to how they have been planned. So it depends on the bureaucratic structures, and of course adjustments must be made in some cases, and of course could be some exercise of discretion powers. Let's say the policy has been made, but then it is being implemented at local councils. Uh, then the local councils also have discretion to make some particular changes to fit their context, depending on the availability of resources and the environments within which the policy is being implemented. So these such contexts and bureaucratic structures could act as policy, could lead to failure or success. And of course, policy failure may result from, for instance, according to Stone, inaccurate or incomplete research during formulation, or bureaucratic incompetencies during implementation, or bureaucratic resistance during formulation, adoption, and implementation, that they do not want to do so because it might otherwise affect their activities. For instance, consider a policy on corruption. Then it could also result from defective policy design, which were not done well as a result of incomplete research. It could also be result in insufficient resources or expertise, but also inevitable modification of policy in implementation. So if constraints or ineffectiveness are met, the government uses substantive organizational tools such as government corporations, to implement the policy. For instance, cooperation, look at these authorities, the Kampala Capital City Authority, or NEMA, National Environment Management Authority, or these other authorities. Those are the government corporations I'm talking about. That if ministries have failed to implement such, then the government corporations should come in to assist in that case. Or public enterprises, or directly administered public service delivery, combined with procedure tools such as public hearings or reviews or evaluations. For instance, I don't know if you have heard of the barazas. Barazas are part of what we call community-based monitoring and evaluation, that are used by local governments to evaluate whether public service delivery is done according to people's needs. So those you get a particular groups of people who work with the service providers to see whether to evaluate whether services are done accordingly. Number 6 is the public evaluation, which follows implementation. Now, as you've heard, during implementation, I've been mentioning the word monitoring. So during implementation, monitoring takes place. In simple terms, monitoring is a process, is an ongoing process, or an ongoing assessment that checks performance. Okay, so it looks at whether the things are done the way they are supposed to be done towards producing the intended outcomes. So monitoring and evaluation sometimes go hand in hand, but of course evaluation here is more general, but evaluation can take place even before the policy is done, or during implementation itself, or even at last. So this evaluation that we're talking about here is more of evaluating the impact of the policy. So evaluation in simple terms is a periodic or episodic assessment of whether the intervention, in this case policy, has or is achieving the intended objectives, or has achieved intended objectives. So in other words, impact of the policy. So, policy as a subject of evaluation after registration and implementation is more crucial, and of course, it's a process by which the results of policies are assessed. And the main question is: did the output of the decision-making process, a given public policy, attain the intended goals? And if not, then such reasons should be uh, given why it did not happen. So there is some level of reconceptualization of policy problems and solutions, and of course proposing new changes or reforms after getting the information or data from evaluation processes and assessment. So it's a measure of output, what the policy actually produces, the impact on the target and non-target community, and the degree to which the impact on the community solves the problem that we identified earlier, or that had been identified earlier in the first phase during problem identification. Evaluation actors may include interest groups or bureaucrats or media, think tanks or executive, and the parliament can recall particular implementers and ask them how they have been able to, for instance, implement the policy. So the whole idea is to learn whether or not policies are achieving their set goals. And evaluation can be done by administrative or judicial or political evaluation through elections or think tanks or judicial reviews or managerial performance or budgetary systems within, for instance, ministries. And potential evaluative criteria could involve economic efficiency in terms of resources, equity through fiscal equivalence, or fiscal equivalence in terms of, course, how many, what resources have been taken in what, in which way, and so on, or whether the policy has been fair to everyone, or if it has had impact on all groups equally. That's what we mean by redistribution or equity. And then also accountability in terms of what was used according to the plan, and of course conformance to general morality according to the different laws that are already there, but also adaptability in terms of whether the communities or the public is able to adapt and accept the particular policy that has been put forward. Now, when evaluation is done, and it is evaluation can lead to two trajectories. One is policy change, which goes back to agenda setting, and then they review other policy alternatives, or it could lead to termination, which we are looking at here as discontinuation. So sophisticated versions of the model portray a feedback linkage following evaluation, but evaluation results can feed can take a direction of policy termination. So usually characterized by policy changes or termination. A policy change can depend on the degree of continuity in most public policies, but of course there are two kinds of policy change. One is the normal pattern of policy change, which has to do with tinkering or altering various aspects of policy styles. Therefore, that's why I say it goes back to agenda setting to see other style implementation styles or adoption styles or alternatives that would actually make it better in terms of implementation and achievement of the goals. Or it could be a typical policy change, which is substantial change in policy paradigms or style, the way a particular problem is viewed, and therefore could be approached. If it has been approached from an economic perspective, it could be now approached from a political or social perspective. And of course, there are many events that could influence policy change, such as crises, maybe there is a disaster that happened, or there is war, or changes in governing coalition, change in a regime, party that is ruling, or which definitely changes that. For instance, if we may focus on the US, within just 2 weeks or a few days after Biden takes, after Trump took the office, he altered all the different policies. And then it's the same thing that just happened with Biden after Trump. So those are the things. But when I say changes in governing coalitions and administration and legislative turnover, or it could also changes are directed to earlier stages of the policy, so making an iterative process, as we had already said, or in other words, termination if change is not there. So the new government could decide that the policy is no more. Yeah, just for instance, how Trump did, they decided to withdraw from World Health Organization following the pandemic outbreak, and also signing out from the Iran nuclear deal. But then those have now been reverted, and the Biden administration is now going back through with those. So termination and then changes. So all those follow evaluation processes. So termination involves ending a policy that does not work, or is not necessary anymore, or is not desirable by particular uh, bureaucratic agencies. And it is based on the failure as a result of negative or positive evaluation, or desirability by a particular government. And therefore, evaluation proposals option of feeding back the decision making uh, to delegitimize that particular policy, to put it out. And of course, if perceptions, but of course, successful termination in short term does not guarantee a similar long term result, because at a later stage things could change again, and it comes back. So if perceptions of the problem persist, then a termination will feed back into a reconceptualization of problem, and then things become again a new problem, and then the cycle begins again. If no other substantial alternatives emerges in this deliberation, then could result into the reversal of a termination and the reinstatement of the terminated policy. For instance, that's what I just talked about, the Biden, Trump, Barack Obama politics. Of course, we haven't experienced this in Uganda, for instance, because we have been in the same regime for the last 36 years. So you never know, it could happen in Uganda. If changes happen, some policies could be changed based on that. So simplified, this is a simplified version. I'm not going back to do this, but this is what we just talked about. And if you want an example, let's see if we can look at this. Let me see if okay, let's see if we can watch this. But the same video is embedded in Moodle, so you can watch it anytime if you wish. So let's see if we can watch it here. It's indeed not long, just 6 minutes. Let's see.
Domestic policy is the area of public policy concerning laws, programs, and administrative decisions directly related to all issues and activities that originate within the borders of a nation or that concern its citizens. Domestic policy is different from foreign policy in that foreign policy refers to the manner by which a government advances its interests within the global community. There are 7 stages to the public policy process. Each has distinguishing characteristics, but it's most important to understand that all the stages will merge together into a seamless process. The first stage in the process is problem recognition. At this stage, conditions have become problematic, and citizens, businesses, or interest groups seek out the government for help. Sometimes problem recognition can take years before it becomes apparent. We don't have that kind of time, so let's look at an immediate problem. Here's Bob. Dr. Bob, actually. Dr. Bob works for the Centers for Disease Control, or the CDC. Let's see what happens when people are clamoring for the government to deal with zombies. Zombies are the perfect example because they represent a physical problem the government can fix. Dr. Bob recognizes the zombies by their symptoms: shuffling gait, vacant stare, empty hunger for living flesh, and bad breath. Then the situation gets out of hand. One zombie becomes more zombies. The government needs to do something about it. Dr. Bob files a report. After he finishes running away, Dr. Bob's report starts stage 2 of the process, agenda setting. The CDC reads Dr. Bob's report and recognizes the identified problem: zombies. Because zombies tend to get out of hand and spread quickly at the cost of innocent lives, the government makes the crisis a priority and sets an immediate agenda. Deal with zombies now. While the first 2 stages typically blend together, the third stage takes a little longer. It's called policy formulation. During this stage, the government examines various methods of addressing the zombie problem. Dr. Bob tells the Surgeon General tells the President, and the President consults top advisors to develop a plan of action. First, everybody knows that zombies are infected by a virus, so the President tells the CDC to start developing a cure. Next, everyone knows zombies go crazy, so the President tells the Department of Homeland Security to provide protection and keep order during the crisis. Finally, because people run away from zombies, the President orders FEMA, that's the Federal Emergency Management Agency, to set up refugee centers around the country. Now that a policy plan has been formulated, it needs to be carried out. This marks the 4th stage in the process, called policy adoption. In this stage, the government needs to make sure its actions are legal. So agencies identify existing laws that give the government the authority to enact the policy. If no such laws exist, the legislature works to make new laws that will provide the power needed. That brings us back to the zombies. The executive branch was born to crush some zombies. It is well within its authority to protect the citizens and save the day. But let's say Congress also passes an emergency law that allows the CDC to force citizens to take blood tests in order to identify those infected. Let's also say the President declares martial law so that the military can deal with suspected zombies. Each government department also adopts its own policies in accordance with the President's policy. The CDC adopts a policy that all children will be treated before any adults, and the Army starts training civilian militias to help patrol for zombies. That leads to the next stage and the question of how the government will pay for its new policies. That's why the 5th stage is called budgeting. Given the national crisis of crazy zombies, Congress holds an emergency session and authorizes a discretionary emergency budget of $100,000 billion gazillion dollars. Because who needs a bunch of zombies, right? The executive branch then has the money it needs to carry out its new policies to save the country from the zombie mob. Now that they're flush with coin, the CDC, the Army, and FEMA all arrive to save the day. The next stage is called policy implementation. In this stage, the government executes and administers the public policy on its agenda. So, in this example, the Army shows up to deal with the zombies and directs the survivors to the refugee centers that FEMA has set up. The CDC arrives and takes everybody's blood to determine if anyone else has been infected, while more doctors get to work on developing a vaccine for everyone. After the dust settles, we move to the 7th stage, policy evaluation. At this point, the government determines how effective the policy is. It conducts research and publishes reports. Congress holds hearings. People voice their opinions. In our example, perhaps some people complain they felt the military was too rough on the zombies, or journalists discover that scientists use live humans in vaccine testing. Or maybe the Red Cross considers the FEMA refugee centers to be too unclean. Everyone has an opinion on how the policy was implemented, except the zombies. They don't get a vote. Typically, if the government finds that a new policy is ineffective, the whole process begins again at stage 1, especially if they didn't get all the zombies.
So you can see that example. For instance, if you also factor in the crisis of COVID-19. So right now, for instance, the government has started getting the vaccine, and it's saying that they will start with doctors and teachers and those above 50, because they are more vulnerable. So the government can decide that, okay, it's mandatory that you must take the vaccine, but uh, the, 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 the public also has the rights to, 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 to say they do not want to take the vaccine. So it depends on the kind of problem and what is at stake. So if we could apply the policy cycle in a crisis response policy, so you have, for instance, foresight or scanning or identifying the emergency issues, uh, and then you have formulation, which has to do with impact assessment, and then you have adoption, which has to do with support and advice to regulatory bodies, and then you have implementation, which has to do with independent verification techniques, and then methodological guidance, and then of course implementation of the actual policy, and then you have evaluation of whether the policy has actually indeed helped in crisis response, and then you have crisis response and provide feedback or updates, and then the cycle begins again. So is the policy process or policy cycle model useful? Yes and no. Yeah, as we'll see. So the usefulness of the policy, for instance, it eases the complexity of policy process, because at least each stage is dissected and then it can be treated in isolation from the other, and then we see what happens under each stage. Analysis of policy is easier to define using a policy cycle. The concept brings order into process, and of course also there is understanding of activities of the policy actors at different stage, rather than looking at the policy as a whole without looking at which actors are acting officially or unofficially on particular phases. And also the cycle provides a way to understand policies in the real world, and it can be based on many subsystems. But of course it comes with, it is not in isolation of any criticisms or the negative part of it. So the model has its own weaknesses, and it is criticized therefore that the policy process are unpredictable. Therefore we cannot say, okay, this will happen, then after this will happen. And the cycle is an irrational process, but also that it's extremely complex. In other words, if we say, okay, this must happen, and at this phase these actors are more important than the other, that makes it complex. The policy making is also multifactorial and multidimensional process that cannot be reduced to a single document or proposal or an event. And of course, in reality, the process is not linear, as I have been saying earlier, because the policy activities cannot sequentially happen. Because you'll see at one stage you have to go back to another stage to see if you have the things right or not. And it is rather a political mechanism than public, because it more involves the government activities and political activities that sometimes are not even in favor of the public. And the model lacks the concept of causation. So we already talked about the issue of causation and correlation. Bottom line is that policies are complex and they lack definite definition, but all policies entail guidelines, plans, actions, and regulations used to solve public problems and, of course, to simplify the understanding of the policy making process. Theoretical frameworks such as this policy cycle model must be used to ease the policy processes. So, that brings us to the end of this session. Thank you. I hope you watch those other videos that have been provided on Moodle for your own continuous learning. Thanks. If you have any questions, do not hesitate to ask in the next session. Thank you.